Hello, Browse. We're back with So the Witch Won't Eat Me by Dorothy Bloch. Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide. I've been neglecting these books for too long. I must do some reading. Chapter 12, The Persistence of Childhood Fantasies in an Adult. I only have 40 pages left in this book. Get it out of the way. Not today, but it is a rare experience to find an adult patient entering treatment with her early childhood fantasies intact and available. In the case of Sandra, an only child who was referred in her early 20s, it was possible to trace back to its specific source and to resolve each of the component parts of the still current fantasies we found were already well established when she was 4.5. As her analysis unfolded, it became clear that she had maintained the fantasies, which were her original defense against her fear of infanticide, because the terror that had given rise to them was still undiminished. Both the character and the early incidents of the violence that she had experienced in relation to her parents, as well as the quality of their loving feelings, had apparently rendered a defense of either neurotic or psychotic depression inadequate. In order to provide a minimal sense of safety for herself, she had found refuge in schizophrenia. Danger was the central issue of Sandra's life. It started in the intimacy of her family and radiated outward to encompass the entire world. It invested both what was seen and what was unseen. Reality had not been large enough to contain it, and so she had blended in an unreal world that became an inseparable part of daily experience. Every area of her life had been shaped to accommodate it, and almost every facet of her personality reflected in some degree its all-pervasive character. To make survival possible, she had projected the danger onto imaginary creatures and adopted the fantasy that she was invisible. Here comes the sneezing fits. Fantasy for Sandra had become a way of life and defended her against an ever-present terror. As far as Sandra recalled, it started when she was 3.5, and her parents had bought a candy store in Chicago behind which they made their home. Beyond a vague feeling of something that had come before, which only later began to take on some distinctness, everything else that Sandra knew of her first 3 years was told to her. 3 factors became the focus of her attention. 2 years before she was born, her brother had died of pneumonia at the age of 5, and her mother had revealed, "You would not have been born if he had not died." The other concerned her father, who had been a successful merchant but then went bankrupt. That event and her brother's death had occurred at about the same time as the death of his mother, and had brought about her mother. The event and her brother's death had occurred at about the same time as the death of his mother. And had brought about what her mother described only as a change in her father that she couldn't understand. I'm confused about who's who there. The third concerned Sandra herself, who had been nursed until she was almost 1 year old, and then her mother had related to her sadly and accusingly, had vomited every time she saw her mother's breast. What the fuck? Sandra was a small but beautifully proportioned girl who, except for the traces of illness in her face, was very attractive. Her appearance was that of an adolescent. Her manner of dress very plain and shorn of any decorative function. She wore her blonde hair drawn tightly off her face in a knot at the back. Her manner of sitting and lying on the couch was marked by great rigidity, and by sudden changes of position in which her arms and legs described unusual angles. She might suddenly clasp her hands behind her neck or the small of her back and maintain them there for several minutes, her legs meanwhile intertwined in a curiously acrobatic way, and thrust to the right or left, her toes outstretched, a general tautness investing her entire frame, which then would give and reorganize itself in an equally rigid manner. She also had a way of drawing in her breath as though to sigh, but then retaining instead of expelling it. Only later did I discover that her concentration on body movement stemmed not only from a continual state of tension, but from the need always to keep herself on the alert and ready to go at a moment's notice. My questioning drew the reply, "I could be out of here in 10 seconds. Flat. And her communications were always expressed with great precision. She frequently prefaced them or followed them with the comment that she knew she wasn't clear, or that she was afraid it wouldn't come out right, or that she spoke in a jumbled way. She had many disturbing and mystifying symptoms. For instance, she found it difficult to judge distances. When she stepped off a curb, she never knew just how far to put her foot down. She was also confused about the distances of cars, or even of our relative positions in the room. An object might be 5 feet away or 50. She was never sure. She had the same trouble with time. She couldn't remember if an event had occurred yesterday, or last week, or 3 weeks ago, a year ago, or several years. At times, objects had a heightened clarity, as though they were as though they vibrated. Sometimes she had the sensation that people were behind glass walls and very far away, or she felt she was floating. She went out of contact, and sometimes it was a week or several weeks before she returned. She was clumsy and often bruised herself against objects. At work, she was sure to knock into a desk or basket. My questioning elicited the information that she did not, however, bump into people. She also couldn't remain in one room for more than a half hour, or at most an hour at a time. Relationships were an agony to her. Usually they were structured so that she sat and listened while the other person did the talking. She found it very difficult to be with groups of people because of what she described as the necessity for watching, which required her complete concentration, and which she found impossible with more than one, or at most people at a time, or at most two people at a time. She allowed no detail about the other person to escape her, but when there were several, she lost the thread of the conversation and became confused because there was so much to keep track of. She conceived of relationships as arrangements where she was expected to take care of the other person's person. There is one other factor that must be included among her symptoms. As the weeks progressed, I noted that Sandra seemingly had no wishes. When I commented on it, however, she promptly replied that she wanted to be a ball and proceeded to give an accurate description of a fetus, a little ball which, without any apparent human intervention, had all its needs taken care of. Sandra and her mother had moved from Chicago to New York 2 years before, after her father's sudden death from a brain hemorrhage, and had settled in a dilapidated part of the city. Her mother, at 60, appeared to be a monument of helplessness, and avoided leaving the house except under Sandra's escort. Conversation with her uninterrupted was an uninterrupted monologue, an endless recitation of all the details that made up her ill-starred and miserable life. At the commencement of her treatment, Sandra experienced their relationship as unbearable. When Sandra first came to see me, she stated that she was afraid she might end up staring into space. Nothing had ever happened in her life, and she was at a loss to understand why she felt so upset. The nothing that had happened appeared at first to center only on her father, whom she described affectionately as a sweet, helpless, and passive man. At that point, her memory of him started with the candy store. He spent most of his time sitting immobile in a dim room and could be roused only by vigorous shaking. He was her playmate. Whenever Sandra's mother was busy, she shunted Sandra in to play with her father, and Sandra pulled and tugged, kicked and pinched him, tweaked his nose and ears until he became aware of her. When they proceeded to play the game that he liked, they were Hansel and Gretel, who were pursued by the witch in the dark forest. Until she was 7 or 8, and her father took a job for 2 years, this was their daily activity. When he returned, Sandra, who meanwhile had started playing with children, no longer found this game satisfying, but it was not until she was 11 or 12 that she rebelled. From then until she was 16, she refused even to talk to him. What? And she recalled that any contact with him during that period sent her into screaming fits. When Sandra was 10, she made her first real friend, who came to visit and, to Sandra's surprise, indicated that there was something very strange about her father. It had not occurred to Sandra, but it was true. He was strange. Although Sandra had never thought of her father as strange, she was aware of certain definitely strange phenomena in her world. When she first entered treatment, she stated that she had had the impression that when her father was withdrawn, he was thinking of her brother, and it frightened her. Sometimes she thought that he was with her brother. She admitted to some peculiar concepts about this brother. For instance, she believed that if she had been born because he had died, then if she died, he could return. She conjured up feelings of anger and resentment in him because she had taken his place, and a rage to do away with her so that he could come back. She had created the image of a revolving door with him on the outside and her on the inside. As long as she kept it firmly closed, she was safe. But should she relax, he would swing her out and himself in. In fact, it turned out Sandra had always lived on very familiar terms with the dead. They assumed peculiar forms and were very dangerous. They were the paper-thin black shades whom she had always known. They inhabited the cracks and crevices, and in her childhood were especially thick in the dark hallway that led out into the street. The world was alive with them. They were allied to the creatures that dwelled under the ground, and the black chiffon things that were always alert and watchful and could swoop down without warning and attack. They were all especially bent on destroying children. Sandra had formulated the only possible way to deal with them, to be so quiet that she would pass unnoticed. But even in that quiet, she also had to remain alert and watchful, ready to spring into action. Any quick movements or unusual display caught their attention. She had to be very careful. When she was 4 and a half, some workmen gave her a bracelet that they had found while digging next door. Although she wanted it, she had felt obliged to take the safer course of throwing it back into the ground, lest she stir up the ire of the creatures who might come in pursuit of it. She had also always believed that all dead people, when they got tired of their graves, came back to stay among the living, and she believed it, even though on another level she appreciated its absurdity. Several times in the course of her treatment, she reported in terror having seen one of these dead people, whom she described as rigid and withdrawn. Once it was a man on the street, another time an instructor at a course, or the student who sat next to her, a man in her office, or, most recently, a supervisor. Although the creatures and the shades and the black chiffon things had disappeared as her terror diminished in the course of treatment, after each encounter with one of these beings, they returned. On questioning, it also became apparent that they inspired her with the same feelings that she had experienced in her father's presence when he was withdrawn. At such times, she had always been prompted to take some desperate action, to tug him, pinch him, pull his ears or his nose, or hit him on the head until he came back to life. It was clear that she had always thought of him as dead when he was withdrawn, and as alive when he was in contact. Her concept of the ease with which the dead could pass to and from the land of the living stemmed from this impression. And the black chiffon things, shades, and the creatures. It also appeared that the shades and the creatures and the black chiffon things were all related to her father. But how it was possible to reconcile these deadly figments, which were all especially bent on destroying children, with her sweet, helpless image of him. The perplexing contradiction began to assume some clarity one day when Sandra admitted hesitantly and with a great deal of guilt that she had been a very mean, nasty, and ill-tempered child, given to irrational outbursts of rage, and who, from the age of 11 or 12, refused to participate any longer in the games with her father, leaving him to his uninterrupted stupor. When I commented on the unusual circumstance of a sweet, helpless man and a raging child, she was suddenly amazed at the memory of another image that had not come up in all that time. At first, she recalled merely that, except for the times when they played games, when he was not withdrawn, he was a very irascible, ill-tempered man, given to violent outbursts and incapable of brooking any disagreement. Her own rage was clearly provoked, and a method of defending herself This memory was reinforced by her exaggerated responses to a man in her office, whose sadism she felt she knew no bounds and whose contacts with people were unmarred by any human feeling. She realized that he had reminded her of this other image of her father, which she feared and hated. And I believe I'm going to stop there because I have a state sale to go to today, but no. Yeah, I think I am stopping there because this is a long chapter. All right, that's all, bravs. That's all. Goodbye. Wait. Goodbye. You've just been Ouija'd.